As the warm sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, Chef Mark could feel the anticipation in the air. He had just finished preparing a beautiful spread for the family he was working with today. This wasn't just any family, though. The house was large and immaculate, the type of home where everything seemed to be in its perfect place. But beneath the pristine exterior, there was something else, something that didn't sit right with him. Today, Chef Mark had noticed something strange. A nanny was arriving with a little girl, and from the way they interacted, it wasn't clear if she was just a helper or a permanent fixture in the family's routine. The little girl, Maya, was full of life, but there was something more to her story, something Mark couldn't quite put his finger on. Maya was a black girl, and more importantly, she had a disability, something her parents had been very private about. The nanny, however, seemed to be doing most of the talking, as if Maya didn't need to speak for herself. Mark had worked in countless kitchens, served dozens of families, but today, something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a regular family arrangement. When the parents weren't home, Maya's nanny was the one in charge, and that dynamic wasn't lost on Chef Mark. But what really caught him by surprise was when he overheard a conversation between the nanny and the girl, one that didn't seem as comfortable as it should have been. Maya's mum, Lisa, had just walked into the house unannounced. Mark hadn't been prepared for this sudden shift in the atmosphere. She wasn't angry, but there was a palpable tension in the air. As Lisa walked into the kitchen, scanning the room as if searching for something or someone, Maya's eyes widened when she saw her mother, and for a split second, it looked like there was fear behind them. Chef Mark noticed the subtle discomfort in Maya's expression, her hand clenching the edge of the table, and it made his stomach churn. Lisa's face was calm, but her body language spoke volumes. She asked a few casual questions, but Mark could tell she wasn't here just for a check-in. And then it happened. Lisa's voice tightened as she demanded an explanation about Maya's day, her tone growing more insistent. Her next words sent a chill down Mark's spine. She reached for the phone and, without hesitation, called 911. It was clear that something had set her off, something that wasn't just about a normal family disagreement. What had caused Lisa to react this way? What had the nanny done to trigger such a drastic response? Mark couldn't help but feel that he was caught in the middle of something much bigger than he had expected. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what he had seen and heard. He couldn't shake the image of Maya, standing silently by the kitchen counter, her eyes darting between her mum and the nanny. Mark wasn't sure what had happened behind closed doors, but the anxiety in the room told him it wasn't just a small misunderstanding. With the police now on their way, the house was filled with tension, and Chef Mark stood frozen, unsure of what role he had to play in all of this. Was he just a bystander, or would his knowledge of the family's behavior put him in a position to help? Maya's mum seemed desperate, but also confused, as if she was struggling to understand what had gone wrong with the nanny. And what about Maya herself? What was really going on in her world, behind the closed doors of a home that seemed so perfect? On the outside, this wasn't just a story about a nanny and a little girl. It was about trust, power, and the complex relationships that can form between families and the people they entrust with their most valuable responsibilities. Mark had no idea what was coming next, but he knew that whatever happened, everything was about to change. As the tension hung thick in the air, Chef Mark couldn't help but replay the moments that led up to Lisa's call to 911. The unease he felt earlier had only deepened, especially when Lisa's voice became more frantic. Mark had seen his fair share of stress in his kitchen. Hot pans, last-minute orders, irritable customers. But nothing compared to the discomfort filling the room now. Maya's mother was unraveling in front of him, her calm facade slipping, revealing the cracks in her carefully crafted life. But who was the real culprit? Was it the nanny, who'd been hired to take care of Maya, or was it something else entirely? Chef Mark had been employed by this family for months, but there was always a sense of distance. He'd never been close to them, not in the way some of the families he worked for had allowed him to be. There were polite exchanges, of course, a few conversations here and there, but nothing more. Still, Mark had noticed things over time. He'd overheard little bits of conversations between Lisa and her husband. The way they spoke about Maya's needs, as if they were burdens rather than blessings. It wasn't unusual for wealthy families to have a certain detachment, but there was something about the way they spoke about Maya's disability that stuck with Mark. It didn't feel right. Lisa and her husband, Greg, had always seemed like a picture-perfect couple, the kind of parents who hired professionals to make their lives easier, cleaners, chefs, and nannies, but never really seemed to invest time in their daughter's emotional well-being. Maya had been born with a condition that affected her mobility, and though she had a sharp mind, her world had been limited by her physical constraints. Mark had seen the way her parents treated her, always distant, always focused on appearances. Greg often had his meetings, his calls, his excuses to be away, while Lisa remained in the background, trying her best to hold the facade of a perfect family together. But that didn't explain the sudden phone call. That didn't explain why Lisa was so shaken up. Mark wasn't sure how long he stood there before he realized he hadn't spoken a word. The silence was suffocating. Lisa was now pacing back and forth, speaking to someone on the phone. Maya stood off to the side, her small form hunched slightly, as if trying to make herself invisible. The nanny, a woman in her early 30s named Tanya, seemed unfazed by the situation. She continued to stand in the corner of the kitchen, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold without a word. Mark couldn't quite place it, but Tanya's calmness, almost a sense of detachment, was beginning to feel unsettling. It was as if she had seen this before, as if she were prepared for this exact moment. The doorbell rang, pulling Mark from his thoughts. A soft, almost nervous knock followed. Lisa's voice cut through the air, her hand trembling as she placed the phone down. "That's them," she muttered, mostly to herself. It was clear from her expression that Lisa wasn't just scared. She was lost, confused. She had called 911, but what exactly was she expecting the police to do? Maya's eyes flicked nervously toward the door, and for the first time, Chef Mark saw fear, real, raw fear, in her gaze. This wasn't the confident little girl he had seen earlier, the one who laughed at silly jokes and shyly asked for seconds of dessert. No, something had shifted. The girl he saw now was frightened. As the police arrived and stepped inside, Mark could feel the weight of their presence. The officer at the door had a professional air about him, but even he seemed a little taken aback by the situation. Lisa greeted him with a tight smile, though her eyes were wild. "I'm sorry to bother you," she began, trying to maintain some semblance of control. But her voice cracked. "But I'm worried about my daughter's safety. Something's wrong with her nanny. She's not acting right." The officer nodded, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the strange tension in the air. Mark could sense the unease building, and it wasn't just from Lisa or Maya. Tanya was still standing by the counter, her posture almost too perfect, like she was waiting for something to happen. "Ma'am, could you please tell me what's going on?" The officer asked, his tone even, though Mark could sense the underlying confusion in his voice. It was clear he hadn't expected this kind of call. Lisa took a deep breath, her hands clenched together as she spoke. "I've been having some concerns. I've noticed things that don't add up. Maya's been acting differently when Tanya's around. She's withdrawn, more anxious, and I think it's because of Tanya. I just don't know what to do." The officer turned toward Tanya, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is there something you'd like to explain, ma'am?" For the first time, Tanya spoke, her voice soft but firm. "There's nothing going on here that's out of the ordinary," she said calmly, though Mark could tell there was something guarded in her tone. "I've been taking care of Maya for months now, and everything's been fine." Mark watched as Lisa's face twisted in frustration, but it was Maya who suddenly broke the silence. She stepped forward, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I don't feel safe with her." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Maya's voice trembled, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. The room went still. Maya's confession had cracked something open, something Mark couldn't ignore. The situation was no longer just about a nanny and her employer. It was about something much darker. Tanya's eyes flicked nervously toward the girl, but she quickly regained her composure, stepping back toward the door as if she were trying to retreat. The officer turned toward Maya, his expression softening. For a moment, "Maya, sweetheart, do you want to tell me what's going on?" Mark watched as the young girl hesitated, her eyes darting from her mother to Tanya, and then back to the officer. "I don't like when she touches me," Maya said in a voice so quiet it almost got lost in the noise of the room. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Lisa gasped, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. The officer's expression shifted instantly from polite concern to cold suspicion. He turned toward Tanya, his voice now harder. "Ma'am, I think it's time we had a talk." The atmosphere in the room shifted in an instant. What had begun as an ordinary day, with a simple meal being prepared, was now spiraling into a nightmare. Secrets were being exposed, and the tension was building to a breaking point. Tanya's calm exterior was starting to crack, but would she break down and confess, or would she deny everything? Mark could feel the eyes of everyone in the room turning toward him, expecting him to speak. He was the only one who had been around long enough to witness the strange interactions between Maya and Tanya. But what had he seen? Could he help bring the truth to light, or was he just as clueless as everyone else? With the police now in control of the situation, Chef Mark stood at the edge of it all, unsure of what was to come next. The room was filled with uncertainty, and the question that lingered in the air was impossible to ignore. What had really been happening behind closed doors? The officer's eyes never left Tanya as he stepped forward. The tension in the room felt like it could snap at any moment. Maya was standing quietly by her mother now, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. Mark stood a little to the side, watching, his heart racing. He didn't know exactly what was going on, but he could feel the weight of the moment. Whatever this was, it was much bigger than he had first thought. "Mom, I need you to come with me," the officer said firmly, his voice filled with a quiet authority that left no room for doubt. Tanya's composure faltered for a split second, a fleeting glance of panic crossing her face. For the first time since this whole situation had begun, Tanya looked vulnerable, but she quickly masked it, straightening her posture and crossing her arms defensively. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but still trying to hold on to its calm facade. Mark's stomach tightened. He didn't want to believe what Maya had just said. He didn't want to believe that the nanny, the person hired to protect and care for this little girl, could be capable of anything so sinister. But the doubt was there. The subtle signs, Maya's withdrawal, Tanya's strange behavior, had been pointing to something darker all along. The officer nodded, signaling for Tanya to follow him. But then, as if to reinforce the weight of the situation, he turned to Mark. "Chef, you've been here longer than anyone. If you know anything, now's the time to speak up." Mark froze, unsure of what to say. What could he say? What had he really seen? "Look, I'm not sure," Mark stammered, his voice unsure. "But I did notice things. I'm not saying Tanya did anything, but..." He trailed off, not sure if he was making it worse by even speaking up. Lisa was watching Mark now, her eyes full of desperation. "Please, Chef Mark, tell them everything. We need to know what's been going on." Mark's mind raced. It wasn't just the things he had noticed between Tanya and Maya. It was the way Tanya had always seemed a little too detached, a little too cold. It was the way she acted as though Maya's disability wasn't something to be taken seriously. The way Tanya often dismissed the little girl's needs, as if they were an inconvenience rather than an obligation. Suddenly, it all clicked. Tanya wasn't just a caregiver. She was someone who had been hiding behind the facade of competence and calmness. Mark had seen that the moments of tension were never really about Maya being a burden to her parents. They were about Tanya finding ways to manipulate her situation and make herself the center of it all. Mark took a deep breath and stepped forward, his voice more confident now. "I did see her. Tanya, I mean. She was sometimes too harsh with Maya, especially when Maya would ask for help with her mobility. It felt like she wasn't treating Maya like a little girl anymore, more like an obligation. I didn't think it was anything serious." At first, Lisa's face turned pale. Her hands were shaking. "Oh my God, how could I have not seen this?" The officer placed a hand on her shoulder, a quiet sign of support. "We'll get to the bottom of it. Don't worry." Tanya's face was turning red now, her eyes darting around the room. She realized the game was up. She turned to the officer, her voice cracking. "This is a misunderstanding. But the officer wasn't listening anymore. He turned toward his radio, speaking quietly into the device as he made arrangements for Tanya's arrest. In that moment, it was as if the entire house exhaled, the air no longer thick with the pressure of secrets, but with the strange calmness that follows the truth being revealed. Maya, still standing by her mother, looked up at Tanya with a mixture of fear and something else, relief. As Tanya was escorted out of the house, Lisa dropped to her knees, her eyes welling with tears. "I'm so sorry, Maya," she whispered over and over, clutching her daughter tightly. "I never should have let her in. I should have seen the signs." Mark quietly stepped back, his mind still spinning from everything that had happened. There had been so many pieces to this puzzle, so many subtle signs that had been ignored until they could no longer be overlooked. Maya's mother, too focused on appearances and her own busy life, had failed to see what was happening right under her nose. And Tanya, the woman she had trusted to care for her daughter, had been hiding her true intentions, using her position to control and manipulate the situation. As the officer left with Tanya in custody, the house began to feel emptier, quieter. Lisa looked up at Mark, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. Mark didn't have an answer. It wasn't about thanks. It was about seeing the truth come to light, about realizing that sometimes the smallest voices, like Maya's, had the most important things to say. Mark nodded, his heart heavy, but knowing that he had done the right thing. As he left the house, later that evening, Mark felt a strange peace wash over him. The family was safe, and Maya, though shaken, was finally free from the grip of someone who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. There were lessons here, for Maya, for Lisa, and even for Mark, trust wasn't something that should be given lightly. And sometimes, even the smallest actions could change everything. The last thing Mark saw as he drove away was Maya standing in the doorway with her mother, holding her hand tightly. It was a simple moment, but it spoke volumes. The love between them was stronger than the chaos that had just unfolded, and that, Mark realized, was the most important thing of all. Oh, Minnie,